Welcome to the latest episode of International Law Chats, a podcast from the American branch of the International Law Association, ABILA for short. The podcast airs on the first Monday of every month, and we hope you will be able to join us each month whenever you listen to your podcast. I'm Chiara Giorgetti. I'm a professor of international law at Richmond Law School and senior fellow at the International Claims and Reparation Project at Columbia Law School.
And I'm Milena Sterio, a professor of international law at Cleveland State University's College of Law and also managing director at the Public International Law and Policy Group.
Our guest today is Leila Nadya Sadat, who's James Carr Professor of International Criminal Law at Washington University Law School, former president of ABILA, and current president of the Board of Directors of ABILA. Leila, if I may, has served as a special advisor on crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court Prosecutor from 2012 to 2023, and was recently appointed as a U.S. expert to the OSCE Moscow mechanism. She recently served as a fellow at the Shell Center for Human Rights at Yale Law School and received the Gollard T. Butcher Medal from the American Society of International Law in April 2025. A renowned scholar, she's one of the world's foremost authorities in the fields of public international law, international criminal law, human rights, and foreign affairs. She has more than 170 publications to her name and regularly lectures and teaches abroad. She received Washington University's Other Wholly Competent Distinguished Faculty Award in recognition of her leadership on the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty Initiative, a groundbreaking project she launched that wrote the world's first treaty on crimes against humanity and continues to work for its adoption by the United Nations. Welcome, Leila. It is really a privilege to have you here today.
Thank you. It's great to be with both of you.
Now, Leila, given your extraordinary expertise on the issue of crimes against humanity, we are particularly pleased to have you here at the International Law Chat podcast to discuss the draft treaty on crimes against humanity. Let me start with a general question. Can you give us an introduction to the topic and maybe also explain to us why it is important at this juncture to specifically develop a treaty on crimes against humanity, especially since the crime is already covered by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and has been part of the statute by many others, of many other ad hoc tribunals? What is the benefit of also having a specific treaty?
Thank you so much, Chiara, and thank you really to you and Milena for doing this and to the American branch for standing up this amazing podcast series. So when we started our project, we made sort of two assumptions, and this is now going back to 2007, 2008. One was that the International Criminal Court, because of the doctrine of complementarity and the court's small size, would be unable to hear most cases of atrocities in the world. That is, that the court's capacity simply would be insufficient to handle it, and all the ad hoc tribunals were starting to wrap up. So we saw a burgeoning capacity deficit, if that makes sense, looming, even with the creation of the International Criminal Court, which was obviously an important achievement. The other assumption that we made, and we did an actual empiric study on conflict levels that had taken place since 1945 and the Commission of Atrocities, is that unfortunately the Commission of Atrocities would continue. That is, the establishment of the court alone and the progress that we had made was not going to be sufficient to staunch sort of the simmering situations we were seeing around the globe. And unfortunately, both assumptions, which we were challenged mightily on in 2007 and 2008, they've proven to be true. The ICC takes very, very few cases. The ad hoc tribunals are done. There is virtually no capacity or interest in the international community to create new ad hoc tribunals. And so we need to look to national systems. And so that's really where growth is going to come in international criminal justice. And the other thing is that atrocities are taking place around the globe. And we only need to look at the three, sort of worst conflicts, if one could say, Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, and say this is an unacceptable situation. So unfortunately, we need more capacity, we need more justice, and we don't have it in current institutions. And that's just the sad reality of the world we live in today. The other thing I'd add is that the International Criminal Court statute doesn't have an obligation of prevention. remember the very important case, and this was really the spark that lit my fuse, was Bosnia versus Serbia. Because in Bosnia versus Serbia, the International Court of Justice gave life to the prevention obligation in the Genocide Convention of 1948. And we don't have that for crimes against humanity. We had responsibility to protect, but a very sort of nascent, not juridical obligation necessarily, more I'd say a political one. And so all of a sudden we had the ICJ saying there's a real obligation in the convention coming from the words prevent. And so we need that for crimes against humanity. And we know from looking, and this is where my study at the ICC comes in, crimes against humanity are the huge workhorse of international criminal justice because they cover state and non-state actors, and they happen in peacetime as well as wartime. You don't need to show the existence of an armed conflict. You don't need to show the intent to destroy, which you do for genocide. And so really we see at the ICC that 30% or more of the cases and situations there only are dealing with crimes against humanity. So we have a huge sociological gap, a juridical gap, a prevention gap, and an impunity gap. And that was really the impetus for the project. And I think the need is even more evident today.
Leila, let me jump in and ask a question that's more specific to the draft treaty on crimes against humanity. So where do things stand currently with respect to the draft treaty? Because my understanding is that significant movement and progress has taken place within the UN specifically over the past year, and that the draft treaty has been advanced out of the United Nations Sixth Committee. But can you please walk us through some more detail about where things are currently?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Milena. And we'd love to focus just on 2024 because it was such a great year for the treaty. But I think we have to acknowledge that there was so much toiling in the vineyard prior to December 4th, 2024 and November 22nd, 2024. The International Law Commission worked on this after we finished our project in 2010. The ILC took it up, and from 2013 to 2019, sort of advanced its own draft articles in conjunction with sort of working with states and civil society. The ILC came up with what we now call the 2019 draft articles. And then the International Law Commission presented those to the General Assembly. And in 2019, and the General Assembly has this committee that does legal affairs, the Sixth Committee. And we really thought we were going right to diplomatic negotiations. Part of it was some states' obdurate, opposition to the concept of creating this treaty. But we always had the same small number of states in opposition. And meanwhile, through the efforts of, I'd say myself, my partner Akila Radhakrishna at Global Justice Center, other members of civil society, we started to really grow momentum. And so in 2022, some states that emerged as the champions from the treaty sort of flipped the whole thing on its head and deposited what we call a zero draft resolution in the Sixth Committee, which set out a 2-year time frame for discussion of the draft articles, requiring the Sixth Committee to take a decision in 2024 on their ultimate fate. And that was Mexico and the Gambia that led that, but it was cross-regional. The United States was part of it, the UK, Korea. We had very broad Latin American participation. And so for 2 years, there were discussions. The Sixth Committee met in interactive format. The draft articles were discussed in clusters, and we understand that the diplomatic conference may actually work on the basis of the same clusters established. So this mode of working, I think, is going to continue on. And so they worked and worked and worked, and we saw growth. I've published some of this data, but every year my students and I count, the state support. And we came up to 125 states vocally in support from all regions in November 2024. And so on November 22nd, the Sixth Committee then was asked to adopt a resolution sending this to diplomatic negotiations, that is, to convene a diplomatic conference. And that day was so full of drama, it's sort of impossible to capture how tense and ongoing and challenging those negotiations were. They thought everything was locked down. They made really significant concessions. They prolonged the timeline for negotiation. They added the PrepCom. They reduced potentially civil society participation. Lots of concessions were made. And at the end of the day, it was adopted by consensus, and the Russian Federation dissociated from the resolution. And then that high drama moment, which was met with clapping and applause and some very powerful statements, Then that 6-committee draft gets sent to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly adopted it on December 4th, 2024. And that's Resolution 79/122 that now sets out basically a 5-year, we say it's a 4-year, but it's a 5-year timeline for negotiation of the treaty.
Thank you. How fascinating. There's really nothing like an eyewitness account. And I can hear very much how much you've been involved. So now you told us what has happened so far until the end of the year. And I believe that the first formal meeting of the prep committee for the diplomatic conference will begin in January 26 in New York, right? And will you be there? So as a follow-up, what are your expectations for the negotiations? What have been some of the major challenges regarding developing this treaty, or maybe some of the major sticking points? Do you expect the same issues that you've seen in the negotiation to resurface during the follow-up now with the PrepCon?
Well, I think the end of 2024 was a very special time, and I think we're heading into a much more difficult moment in international affairs, and the changeover in U.S. administrations is an undeniable factor in that. It's true that the opening, there will be a meeting in October, but it's really just an agenda meeting in the 6th committee, not to reopen anything, but to sort of put a pin and discuss a little bit how the opening of the preparatory committee is going to go. The preparatory committee will meet from January 19th to January 30th in New York City. I will be there. I have to figure out how to teach on Zoom maybe, but I'm not going to miss this. And they're going to set out the working modalities. And actually, there's a working group that's created by the resolution that's going to meet in conjunction with the preparatory committee, because the idea is states during the 2 years between 22 and 24 were suggesting amendments, but they weren't proposing specific text. And so those amendments and proposals are now going to be put into concrete form, compiled by the preparatory committee, and then sent to the diplomatic conference. So there'll be a meeting in January 26, another meeting in August 27, and then we start convening 3-week sessions of the diplomatic conference in 2028 and 2029. We do expect, because we're in a much more challenging geopolitical environment, much more opposition to things that we thought were sort of taken for granted. We've seen this fight at the ILC in other areas, for example, immunity of foreign officials for international crimes. I don't think anybody expected a fight on that. I certainly didn't expect a fight on that issue. That seemed well established 80 years ago at Nuremberg, that there was no immunity for the commission of international crimes, particularly for former officials, right? For current officials, other than the Troika, there had never been immunity, ever, really. And so all of a sudden, this idea of immunity for foreign officials started coming up in the International Law Commission. So I can see that that's going to be a source of debate. We're also lots of other things that we thought were sort of settled areas of international criminal law could become unsettled in a difficult geopolitical environment. One of the important elements of crimes against humanity is the prevention element. And if we want this treaty to function like the Genocide Convention, the dispute resolution clause has to have a compromissory clause that allows states on an erga omnes basis to seize the ICJ and bring the cases that we've seen. Think of Ukraine versus Russia, South Africa versus Israel, Gambia versus Myanmar, this whole host of recent litigation that's allowed states to invoke state responsibility, not individual criminal responsibility. We could see some pushback on those elements as well. There are elements of the treaty that I call sort of the bones of the treaty, the structure. Things like reservations. Is there going to be a Martens Clause? What's the erga omnes standing of states to bring actions that don't go to the definitions of crimes and other aspects of more the substantive law? Most of the energy of civil society goes into the definitions. Gender apartheid is a campaign, right? Slave trade. We're seeing a lot of movement around definitions, not so much attention to what I call sort of the deep structure of the treaty. And so ABILA has graciously allowed me to stand up a study group, which Milena's going to participate in, that's going to take a look not just at things like the definitions, which are already really something that civil society is very energized about. And so we can see great papers coming from Amnesty and Global Justice Center and individual scholars, but also some of these deeper sort of structural issues, because it's necessary that the treaty at least do no harm to the existing understanding of international criminal law. That was the impetus that drove our project. You can't make it weaker than the Torture Convention or weaker than the Apartheid Convention or weaker than the Enforced Disappearances Convention. And we know we're heading into this really challenging geopolitical moment where states are brazenly committing atrocities sort of shamelessly. And the other thing about crimes against humanity, and sorry for going on, but this is a really important point. We're starting to see states defend the commission of atrocities like crimes against humanity and genocide by saying, hey, it's wartime. We get to do this. And my point is, no, these are peremptory norms of international law. You can't defend a genocide or the commission of crimes against humanity by invoking the laws of armed conflict. And so I think that's going to be an area of deep, not controversy, but states are going to push that envelope, and it's going to be important to have legal reasoned arguments to push back against some of that. We're hearing it sort of evoked as IHL is the lex specialis, which sounds very innocuous until you realize that what they really mean is the right to commit genocide in wartime. And that would take us back, prior to the Nuremberg trials. That's what we laid down at Nuremberg. So I think, Chiara and Milena, we're in for a very long and protracted and challenging negotiation.
Well, Leila, thank you so much for that comprehensive answer. And you've really set up nicely for the next question, which is then, what is next in terms of persuading states to adopt the draft treaty, knowing that we have the text of the draft treaty, we have meetings scheduled, there's going to be an entire framework for these negotiations. But what is next in terms of actually persuading states to adopt the draft treaty?
So what we really need is two things. And I was lucky enough to participate in the Rome Statutes negotiation, sitting at Sharif Fassioudi's elbow. I'll never forget that experience, right? I was only 10 at the time. But I remember sitting there, and we need two things. We need a like-minded group of states that develops a core set of principles and that reinforces their commitment to the treaty. And we need a civil society campaign. And we need a convener for the civil society campaign. Everybody keeps pointing at me, and I keep saying, I have a full-time day job. I'm not sure how that's going to work. But those are the two things. And the other thing that's exciting, right? So some of the exciting things, obviously, we see the winds of opposition in front of us, but this was Global South led. It was led by Mexico and the Gambia. And that is a thrilling development. This was, of course, the European Union was very, very supportive. I worked extensively with many of my European colleagues. The EU hosted a very important session. And so, we've seen real support from Europe, from Canada, from Latin America. But Africa came in big time. And that is where I think the treaty will have to respond to African concerns. We've seen them come in and talk about environmental crimes, colonial crimes. They want a reparations provision. That's going to be a fight, right? Although it's in all the UN impunity guidelines that there should be reparations for massive human rights violations. We've seen a small group of states starting to talk about environmental crimes, including Vanuatu and the states that have been leading the charge on the environment in the General Assembly more broadly. So I think we can pull and of course, gender. So gender, and I'm thinking of your work on gender, Milena, in particular. That's been a huge component of this, and women have really pushed women's organizations. The gender initiatives convened a meeting in The Hague last December on this, Women's Initiative for Gender Justice. And I think we're going to see a real push on gender to at least hold the line, if not make the treaty more progressive. Children's rights, disability rights, I think those are going to have to come under a broad tent of civil society campaign. And I think there's enough positive energy because states do see this treaty as a hope for the future. That was a great quote that came out of the December meeting I just referenced, that the treaty's not just a piece of paper, it's a promise to survivors. And so it's a promise to survivors that the kind of atrocities we're now seeing around the globe are A, illegal, and B, somebody's going to do something about them because, both are really important. And so then the ratification campaign starts, and, that won't even start till 2029 because negotiations are supposed to conclude in 2028 and 2029. One of the things, I should mention this, because the treaty has now left the 6 committees orbital force, thank God, we can vote on things. So states don't have to be held hostage where of course, there's going to be a drive for consensus and universalism and unanimity, but where there are real differences of views, states can vote. And that's going to make a big difference in being able to advance the ball. If you have just a handful of states really trying to promote anything regressive or stalling, you can just outvote them. And that was never possible during the last 6 years. So that's going to be a big change over the next 4 years.
Now, you partially answered this, but let me go back to this point about really the next stage. So how are you approaching the next stage where significant advocacy and really non-legal work will be necessary in order to persuade key states to adopt the draft treaty? How do you keep up the energy level? What are your plans for sort of, 2028, 2029 when we enter the second stage, where really now it's about persuasion and advocacy? We have the draft treaty. We've done all the prep work, but then it's a question of getting a number of key states to actually say yes to the draft treaty.
Yeah, no, I mean, so the formation of the like-minded group is super important. And we started to see that. What's going to be interesting, I'll know more in January of 2026 to see who's attending in New York. So that one of the challenges we've always had with this long process is that delegations turn over in New York. So you have meetings with all these legal advisors, you have these workshops, and the German mission was fantastic. And to that point, we're going to need a lot of conferences. Sort of what we did is to socialize the treaty as delegations were coming in. The German mission held a series of meetings in 2023 and in 2024 before the April resumed session of delegations. And that way we could, again, bring in a group of experts, talk about what's in the treaty, what are some of the issues. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to do that every single year because the rotation in New York means that you have new people coming on board. So civil society will need to be really active in standing up conferences, regional meetings. I found during my leadership of the initiative for so many years, we had a meeting in Singapore. I did a workshop in South Africa. I did a workshop in Peru. It was important to get out of the United States and go to regions. Priya Pillai from Asia Justice Center has done amazing work in Asia. So we're having to really build that big coalition of CSOs around the globe that can educate in their region, because there has to be pressure on capitals to tell the folks in New York that this is a priority for us. That said, the folks in New York often have a certain degree of agency. So working directly with them, producing position papers. Actually, the study group is going to hopefully produce little snippets of text that could be handed to the delegation. I had one delegation come up to me and say, do you have a provision on a monitoring mechanism? We're very supportive, but we need text. And so the idea is to produce that text, have a group of experts study it, produce text that can literally be handed to delegations, and they can then, modify it or use it, but it gives them a template they can use in their advocacy. So it's going to be big. We have about 43 CSOs very actively involved. Our declaration had, I think, 650 organizations and people going into the last round in December. And Avaz came in with a petition. Avaz is a big civil society organization. They got over 500,000 signatures in 2 weeks, basically, supporting the treaty. So we're going to need that big civil society campaign. It's going to take money, and nobody has money right now. So I remember Jody Williams saying, what was the success of the landmines ban? And she said, well, email. And so that is what we're doing. We're using webinars, email, doing things that are not so costly, but eventually they'll need to be direct local outreach in different regions of the world. So it's going to be a big 5 years. It's very busy.
That's very interesting, really fascinating. A lot of work in front of us, but such important work. And I do hope that you will be able to all be the one that organizes the civil society, as it was suggested. And of course, that you will find the funding. This is such an important cause. Let me ask you, like an immediate follow-up and maybe our last question. In practice, how can individuals and organizations learn about the draft treaty and help the negotiation move forward constructively?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Chiara. And it sounds trite to say, it's right. Think globally, act locally, it's that idea. So there are organizations, our website has a host of resources on it, obviously at Washington University. My students are amazing. They post everything we see. Global Justice Center has a microsite that has information about the treaty as well. They've been standing it up. The big NGOs have thankfully come on board with this. So you can join Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or Asia Justice Coalition, right? Any of the major, and FIDIC in Europe, International Commission of Jurists. Everybody now is working very hard on the adoption of this new treaty. So supporting a human rights organization that you already support is one way to do that. And campaigns inside some states may be necessary. And during the Rome conference, that was true. I read Raphael Lemkin's unofficial biography. It's called Totally Unofficial. And it was a autobiography he started that was then finished by somebody else. It's excellent. And in those days, I mean, I just can't even imagine what he went through because they didn't have email or webinars or podcasts, right? People could subscribe to the ABILA podcast to learn all about this. And we could put some resources under it. He didn't have that. And the poor man literally would just like haunt the halls of the United Nations. He would write to senators. He would write to individuals, probably having to hand type all these letters himself. So we're very lucky these days that we have technology that can assist us. But no act is too small. I suppose that's what I'd finish with. We all feel that we just can't really make a difference. These are such huge global problems. And you look at some of these conflicts and it just makes you cry and think, what can I do? And I tell this story a lot, but I love it. When I was at the ICC and I would go and visit Fatu and do some work in the office, one of the legal assistants who was African had this sort of picture of a mosquito on her bulletin board. And underneath it was written, African proverb, if you ever think you're too small to make a difference, you have not spent a night with a mosquito. And I just love that because it's this idea of like, no matter how small you are, no matter how insignificant you think your action is, one phone call could touch somebody who can really, leverage in some ways. And so everybody can support this treaty, sign the Avaz petitions. I'm sure we'll have more Avaz petitions going out. And it was very meaningful. We heard delegations actually mention civil society and the impact that we had when they were speaking in 2024. There were a few that mentioned us negatively because, clearly we were making an impact and they didn't like that because we don't have authority the way a state government has authority. And so there were a couple of pushbacks against civil society, but clearly we were making an impact because, and I think most people were very grateful for the work of civil society. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So just to wrap things up, once again, a huge thanks to Professor Leila Sadat for being our guest today and talking to us today. We've really enjoyed our conversation, and if our listeners have too, you can join us on the first Monday of every month for more international law chats. Also, a shout out to Freya Dowdy-Wagner, Chief Content Officer at ABILA, who helps us every month putting the podcast together. And so until next month, it is all from us. Thank you for listening.